and we have some incredible speakers. This afternoon, I really want to sincerely welcome the speakers who are really incredible experts and have done amazing work around peatland ecosystems. How many of you know what peatlands are? Okay. See a few show of hands. How many of you do not know what peatlands are? Ah, so you're coming to learn. This is great. This is great. Welcome. Just squeeze in there somewhere. We want to have as many people as possible at the front. So, I work for UN Environment based in Nairobi, and I'm responsible for the Terrestrial Ecosystems Unit, which is basically a program for UN Environment on all things terrestrial, land, from mountains, sources, all the way to the land just before it hits the sea. So I don't deal with anything related to the sea. So my team looks at terrestrial ecosystems that are really exciting and very interesting and fascinating. But some of these fascinating ecosystems are peatland ecosystems, and these are wetland systems that when the vegetation begins to decompose, they pile up and fill up and pile up, but they're also an incredible sink of carbon dioxide. They make a balance and an equilibrium in the system. Now, a number of you saw not very long ago, and I'm sure all of you did, on television that there were fires in Siberia. Unusual, right? It's supposed to be cold, but it was burning. And what was burning were peatlands. And some of these peatland ecosystems, when they actually run out of water, it's literally, that dry, decomposed material is literally like a bomb. It catches fire just like that and takes a long time to actually stop burning. And those are some of the challenges that we're beginning to see. The degradation of these wetland systems, but not only the degradation of the wetland system, the over-extraction, because the actual peat is a fantastic fuel. There are countries around the world that have used to power up energy generators to actually produce energy, power, light, what we have right now, from peat. So how do we sustainably manage these peat ecosystems, and how do we make sure that we have a conversation around these peatland ecosystems? And that's where us as UN Environment have come in, and we've been responsible, and my colleague Diana Kopansky, who sits in my team, is the coordinator of the Global Peatlands Initiative. And so some colleagues over here are members of that initiative, and I'll just introduce them now. And I'll start from the very beginning here. We've got Alexander Baltamas, who's coming from the Greifswald Maya Center. Thank you, Alexander, for coming and joining us. You just flew in this morning. And right next to her is Leonard Akwani, who's coming from the Nile Basin Initiative. And right after Leonard is our brother Alban Kisife, who's coming from the International Climate Initiative, the German government. And right after him is Samer El Shehawi. Is that correct? Great. Also from Greifswald Maya Center. I think I'm pronouncing that properly. Right, so our presenters are going to give us a sense of what's really happening around these peatland ecosystems. But before they do, I just want to mention that we are, as UN Environment, together with many stakeholders, working on several issues. So we're working not just on the actual management of the peatland ecosystems. We're also trying to work on the science. How do these systems actually form? And when they get degraded, what are the implications? And even if they're being used, what are the sustainable uses of these peatland ecosystems? So my colleagues over here are experts who are really in their own mind, in their own sort of personalities. They are amazing individuals who've done research over years, but also not just the research. We're going to hear later on from Leonard, because he works with the Nile Basin Initiative. Now, the Nile Basin Initiative is also an organization, an intergovernmental organization that brings all the countries of the Nile Basin. Now, the Nile Basin is fascinating, and I just need to speak very briefly on that, because it's a landscape where the river itself, the source of the river, begins. There's a bit of contention there. Is it in Rwanda or Uganda? The source, each of them claim the source. But wherever it begins, somewhere there. And then the rivers flow into the Lake Victoria. If you can imagine your map of Africa, and East Africa in particular, the rivers flow into Lake Victoria. And then from Lake Victoria at Jinja, the river starts to exit, and the Nile now continues. Now, the Nile system ends up in Alexandria. in Egypt. And as you all very well know, there's also another river, the White Nile and the Blue Nile from Ethiopia, that join the Nile system. Now the entire basin of the Nile is over 400 million people. And the Nile River flows through Egypt, which is basically a desert. So for the Egyptians, this is some serious stuff. They cannot have this river not flowing, because the lifeline of the Egyptians is the Nile River system. So we're going to hear, without further ado, from Alexandra, who's going to give us a little bit of a background on the importance of these ecosystems. I don't know, is her presentation loaded? Excuse me? The lady at the back? The gentleman at the back? Hi. Can I have the first presentation, please? Great, fantastic. So over to you to tell us about the Nile. We're very excited.
Thank you, Musinna. My name is, again, Alexandra Barthelmes. I'm busy now since 20 years with different kind of peatland studies. Also, I'm during this time at Greifswald continuously, having the chance to be at the university and then step over to the Greifswald Meyer Center, which was founded, I think, 3 or 4 years ago, and it combines up to 50 peatland-related researchers, so different parts, the basic studies on the vegetation, the hydrology, but also the science of economics and also of ethics. So it's anything around, almost anything is covered by the Greifswald Meyer Center. Since about 10 years, I'm also coordinating the Global Peatland Database, which collects, identifies, collects, and integrates peatland data and suitable proxy data, mostly from soil science, into a database that has one aim is a global map, and the other aim is, we have an emission database for 268 countries and regions where we compile together the area of peatlands, the area of drained peatlands, and we estimate the greenhouse gas emissions. And out of this pool of information, we create several meta studies and so on, and inform also policy, UNFCCC, and Ramsar. Okay, this was more the background. And I was asked for today just to give some overview or just to give the venue for Peatlands of Africa. And then I have to see how I can do that because I actually do not speak free. So the question is, where can we expect peatlands in Africa? Just on background, while all peatlands need near permanent wet conditions, so they need the water level on the top of the vegetation, their development, water supply, and landscape setting differ. In the tropics, also in Africa, suitable conditions for peatlands formation are found in the following areas. So in areas with frequent and excessive rainfall, so the humid tropics, areas with high rainfall and restricted evaporation, so montane and alpine environments, and areas where large catchments and topographic features guarantee regular water inflow and retention, so terrain depressions and floodplains, and along coastlines. So it's just to show you the climate map for Africa, just to give you an impression. So Africa, basically to say, peatland development, it depends on the climate, different climate types, on the bedrocks, and also the water supply. These are the main things coming together to create an environment that can develop peatlands. And this shows you just at one glance, we have in Africa a lot of different climate zones. And if it comes, once again, I do not know where to. Sam, are you again? Here we are. We have. So I just wanted to show you the relief map, the topographic map of Africa, and additional to the variable climate zones, we have altitudinal gradients. So we have up to 5,000 meters above sea levels elevations in Africa. So all these things create really a broad variability of peatland types in Africa, of which most are not known really. Yoo-hoo. Ha. And now just to summarize a bit more in the scheme, yet which may be longer in your mind. So peatlands of Africa occur in extensive inland deltas and basins. It's the Congo Basin, but also the Okavango Basin. They occur in plenty of coastal complexes, so deltas, salt marshes, and lagoons. They can be found in large floodplains, in river courses, oxbow lakes, and pond depressions, for example, in the Zambezi floodplain. They occur at lake margins, at Lake Chad, for example, and of course the Lake Victoria has a lot of peatlands at the margins. We have peatlands in montane and alpine environments, and we have it in channeled and unchanneled valley bottoms. So just to give you an impression which landscape types can actually form peatlands. So peatlands of Africa host a diverse natural vegetation that includes dicotyl trees, palms, mangroves, but also grasses and sedges, mosses, and specific flora, specific plants, as for example the Afromontane species. The peatlands of Africa produce different types of peat, which can include wood remains. So peat is peat is the remaining plant part. Peat gets stored from the vegetation, and you can actually do research on this peat that may be several thousand years old, and then deduce which vegetation has 10,000 years ago formed this peatland, and which vegetation you have once upon a time. So just to give you nice pictures of that, so the montane peatlands you find here in the circles. The black ones are where they can occur. The red ones are where I have taken the photos from. So we have Afromontane peatlands, for example, in Uganda. We have them, but we have them also in Lesotho. We have it in the Angolan highlands, where Afromontane peatlands and peaty marshes occur. And we have it, for example, also plenty in the Ethiopian highlands. So other different peatlands here, the flooded grasslands and peatlands. Also just indication where we know that these peatlands are there. They occur in much more places, we assume. We are almost sure. Here gives you some examples from our Nile Basin fieldwork campaign in peatlands, grassland peatlands in Tanzania and Uganda. And of course, what the most people are known is the peat swamp forest, but the most are only knowing the really large Congo Basin peat swamp forest, but we have additional areas too, and especially here in Ghana, we already know the Amanzuri peat swamp forest, which is also a peat swamp forest, a large wetland complex that also include peat swamp forests, and we know it from Maputa land. These are only flashlights of some parts of information that we already have. We can assume a lot of more being there, so I'm quite sure. So what is about peatlands of Africa? The scientific and public knowledge on the location, the distribution, the hydrology, and land use is generally really very poor. The focus is so far most only on single large areas, as for example the Congo Basin, but the multitude of smaller areas that then add up to considerable areas in the countries is still not really recognized. We have done, for example, these exercises in mapping peatlands of East Africa. This is a peatland probability map for Zambia. And within the Nile Basin initiative project that we are running now, we have also done such a mapping for the Ethiopian highlands. So just only at one glance, we have some peatland maps or peatland probability maps available at Greifswald-Meyer Center. And just to give you an idea of how large the areas are, so in Zambia we're expecting more than 10,000 square kilometers. But also in Tanzania and Uganda more than 4,000 square kilometers. Whereas in Northern Africa, we have not detailed maps so far, but we have a lot of information collected over the last 30 years, especially my head, so Professor Hans Joosten, is already collecting material since 30 years on peatlands. Yeah, why bothering about peatlands? So peatlands provide essential ecosystem services. They do water flow regulation, they retain nutrients and remove pollutants, so they are very important for rural water purification or supply of drinking water, actually. They regulate local and regional climate, they sequester carbon and host rare and specialized biodiversity. So peatlands provide actually livelihoods for millions of people, not only in Africa, also in Southeast Asia and South America, but it's really a lack of knowledge in the tropics on peatlands. But we also have here is a very fast expansion of logging and drainage into areas with lower land use pressure so far. So we have seen during our fieldwork in Uganda that really the use of the burning and clearing up of the papyrus swamps are accelerating during the last years. There are usually no proper land survey made before an area gets reclaimed for land use. And we have here in the tropics a very fast iteration of drained peatlands and a loss of all the ecosystem services that I have mentioned before. So we need to speed up mapping them. And I received in preparation for this talk the question how to get the best map of peatlands globally and identify hotspots, including Africa. I was thinking, yes, at the moment, this was too far. At the moment, I can see two basic approaches, so the top-down approach and the bottom-up. The top-down approach actually models a peatland map or organic soil map across the complete globe, while using satellite imagery and GIS processing, and have some verifying points over the globe. And the other thing around it that it is what we are doing, but also other groups, we develop composite maps, peatland maps, departing from what is already available on peatland, soil, and proxy information, and we integrate this to this national, regional, sometimes even local data into a map. I have to say that all of these maps that are currently available are biased by input data, have advances and disadvantages, and also substantially miss or overestimate peatlands in the tropics. I personally, and this is what we are doing, would prefer the bottom-up approach so far. But maybe it would be an idea just to come closer together and maybe we can develop a global peatland map combining both approaches, that it is a modeling approach. So to sharpen independent models for different peatland hosting landscapes across the tropics, what we can see, what I see in all of these new maps is that they are biased. So if you have, for example, a map that mainly comes with the input data from Canada, then it models for the tropics, for example, only the mountain peatlands. The other way around, so what you have on data in the model depends what gets out of that, which brought us to the idea that it might be worthwhile to not only have one model for one map, but to sharpen individual models for different peatland hosting landscapes across the tropics. And then we came back to this picture, so that I have before had. These are the landscapes for which we may adjust the modeling systems. And why we can do that? Of course, we need to have really experienced modelers that, for example, use artificial intelligence. But we can then also inform these models by deep peatland and landscape ecological knowledge and substantiate it by already collected or newly available data, for example, from the global peatland database that we have. So this is just the last slide. I thank you for attention, and I'm happy to receive some question afterwards.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. My goodness. You know, I'm from Zambia originally, and in the region where I grew up in the north, where there are lake systems, I remember as a child when we'd receive this fish. It was almost like from the lake. From the lake Mweru-Wantipa. I mean, this lake system, the fish, you could tell the difference in the fish because the more darker skinned and darker hue fish was coming from the Peatland. And it's really fascinating that you just present this information, and yet you just see all these gaps, all the the absence of data. Really, really fascinating. Thank you so much for that. We're going to have a moment for questions, in a while. But moving on to Leonard. So Leonard is from the Nile Basin Initiative. Now, for us to be able to connect the dots of what Alexandra actually said in terms of what is the science, what is the information, what is the data, we need to come together as a collective. So countries come together, and it's really fantastic that you showed that map of, from reach all the way to kind of like to the lake area and to the coast, reach to reef. How do countries come together? And that's where the Nile Basin Initiative is really relevant and very helpful and useful. Do you have a presentation? Yes. If we can have the presentation from Nile Basin, fantastic. So Leonard, please tell us about the Nile Basin Initiative, the case study, and also the role of the NBI, as it's called, initially within the Global Peatlands Initiative. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now we have heard from Alex that there are peatlands in Africa. And for us who are coming from the Nile Basin region, we can also say there are peatlands in the Nile Basin. Now the next thing is then what? So what do you do? And of course, within this forum, there is a whole talk about restoration. So then you need to create some structures, you need to create some platforms, and to which then you can do restoration or you can conserve some of these peatlands. The Nile Basin Initiative offers such a regional platform, and to which then we can move the agenda of restoration, focusing on peatlands, but also wetlands and other ecosystems. So let me share with you what we're doing in the Nile Basin with regards to peatlands. Okay, I got it. So just to give you a brief information about Nile Basin, this is an area of about 3.2 million kilometers square. And this includes 11 countries. So if you are talking about, for instance, the Bond Challenge, or you are talking about the African 100 Challenge, the Nile Basin itself offers a big area, and to which then you can meet this challenge without going to other basins, okay? And then, of course, the length goes all the way from Rwanda and Burundi upstream, all the way to Uganda, down to the Mediterranean Sea, passing Egypt. The population of these basin countries is 480 million people. The specific population for the basin is 250 million. The Nile Basin is composed of 10 countries. Should be 11, but one of which is Eritrea. It is an observer. So upstream, you have Uganda, DRC, Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi, and Tanzania. And then downstream, of course, you have South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Egypt. So this was launched in 1999, and we're all working towards collaborative water resource management of River Nile. In terms of our main goal, we are all geared towards using the water resources in a more sustainable way for the development of our region, socio-economic development of the Nile Basin region. So that is the shared vision among the riparian countries. We work on 3 main areas. This is facilitating cooperation, bringing these stakeholders together, bringing this country together so that they can share the table and talk and discuss how to conserve the waters. And then there's water resource management, which is all about generating information to inform river basin planning. And then, of course, there is the water resource development. These are the investments, be it conservation investments, be it the energy investments that we are undertaking in the basin for socio-economic development, for the healthy River Nile. And we work on these 6 key areas: water security, sharing water and ensuring that it keeps flowing, energy security, tapping more so on the energy that is provided by water, food security, and then of course the work unto which peatlands and wetlands is anchored is environmental sustainability, and we're all geared towards restoring and conserving these water-related ecosystems. And then of course the issue of climate change, focusing more on adaptation, and then of course transboundary water governance, which is policies, rules and regulations and cooperation. Why peatlands in the Nile? So peatlands, as part of wetlands, they cover 5% of the River Nile, and they offer multiple ecosystem services, which are very key. Whether you want to talk about food, whether you want to talk about biodiversity, whether you want to talk about water supply, water purification, carbon sequestration. So they offer a lot. So it's not only about storing carbon. It's livelihoods and whatever. So that is why it is very key in the Nile. And then, of course, issues of climate change, adaptation and mitigation and resilience is very key from what we get from these wetlands and peatlands. And then, of course, we want to ensure that they are mainstreamed within river basin planning, because most of these people working in the water basin are engineers. Then they want to have their dams, they want to get their water. So you really need to bring in wetlands and whatever in the river basin planning so that it's catered for and it is sustained. And then, of course, our work, though we work with the counties, but we focus our work on transboundary wetlands and wetlands of regional significance. Transboundary wetlands shared between 2 counties and more, and then regional wetlands can be within a country, but they have an impact in the basin, like Sud wetlands in South Sudan. Just giving you a report, we work with these counties, and the report that we receive and the report that we are working on, that there are challenges within the basin. One of the challenges is the lack of baseline information, as even have been captured from my colleague Alex on peatlands, but there is a lot of lack of baseline information on these peatlands. Then there is overall degradation, whether from agriculture, whether from invasive species. There's a lot of degradation, and then there is this infrastructure which are popping up in the basin all over, which are also impacting on the river and the wetlands and the peatlands. And then there is the extraction of minerals and oil, as some of these are discovered along key areas of wetlands and peatlands, like in the Alberta and Rift as you go down. And then issues of climate change, which is a very key issue in the basin as a challenge. And then within these countries, there is conflicting and overlapping governance instruments. Like you go into a country which shared a peatland. One of it is doing agriculture, one of it is conserving. And then you know from science that if another part is draining, then when there is subsistence, they go down, the other part will also collapse. So there are those issues that we are struggling with, and then there is minimal transboundary collaboration within these countries. But there are inspiring case studies that we are seeing within this region, as captured from the status report. Restoration, which is going on. Rwanda removing a whole industrial park in a wetland and restoring it. There are wetland atlases which are showing us where we can get these peatlands and conserve them. There's management and investment plans which are coming up. There's national policies which are very responsive to peatlands issues. And then we're also dealing with the dry wetlands, like the Mayas in Sudan. And then, of course, issues of mapping environmental flows, which are very key for this. The main issue here is the scale. Are they in a reasonable scale which can help? Okay. It is good to share transboundary challenges, because this then provides our relevance. If it is within the countries will do it. But if it is within the 2 countries, then you need to bring a convener like Nile Basin to help. So the transboundary challenges we are facing, even as we deal with these peatlands, the upstream, downstream tension, there is the fight over Nile waters. So that challenge is still there. There is the multiple political 2 countries not agreeing, and therefore, if it is a transboundary peatlands, even how to start conserving it becomes a problem. then there's sovereign interest or the nationalistic interest. Some countries are just interested in what they're doing within their country. So those are the challenges we're dealing with. Another one is political instability, where one, like if you are developing a transboundary wetland management plan, one county is unstable, the other one. So how do you, because you need to bring in those two counties together. And then of course, minimal collaborations between those. So those are the challenges that makes us relevant, the challenges we are dealing with to ensure that there is conservation of peatlands at the regional level or at the transboundary level. Within NBI, we have come up with a framework which these countries have agreed upon to ensure that this helps us conserve the peatlands and the wetlands. There are many, I will only cite two of them. There is the NBI Wetland Management Strategy, which helps us to move the agenda of conserving wetlands and peatlands. And then, of course, there is also climate change strategy, which is based on ecosystem-based adaptation. And this normally is all about nature-based or working with nature to deal with issues of climate change or to conserve. And many others like environmental flows, ensuring that these systems have water. So we have agreed on all this framework for wise use. Specifically what we are doing on peatlands work, there is, we are dealing with transboundary wetlands and wetlands of regional significance I've shared. We are generating knowledge base. We are generating knowledge about these peatlands so that then we can use that knowledge to inform our intervention. And that work will be shared by the next presenter. And then we are also developing transboundary wetlands management plans. Whether it is a plan we are developing in Siosteko, shared by Uganda and Kenya. We are developing one in Semliki, shared by DRC and Uganda. We are developing one in Sango Bay, Minziro, which is shared by Tanzania, and many others. So we are developing all these transboundary wetlands, investing in them, so that the peatlands and the wetlands can be conserved within that. Also, we are undertaking now evaluation of ecosystem services, because you need to offer a business case. Why do we need to conserve? Can we remove these peatlands and wetlands and have, for instance, agriculture? So we really need to do, we are doing evaluation so that we can use this to advocate within policy making. And then environmental flows assessment. What is the required amount of water for these ecosystems? We are developing those information so that we can allow, within the water management planning or water allocation plan, we can allow the flows for the Nile. And then, of course, all around, when you talk of restoration, we need to develop bankable projects. So we have a portfolio under which we are developing that. And then, of course, for those who knows the Paris Agreement, the Nile Basin countries are part of Paris Agreement. They are going to revise. So we want the information we are generating from the peatlands and from the wetlands to be part of those national determined contributions. So we are all working on that. And then, of course, we will help our countries to report, whether it is Ramsar Convention, we help our countries to report on those issues as what they have done within the regional platform of NBI. This is how we have organized our work. We have the ministers as the top organ. We have the Nile Technical Advisory, which is from the ministries from the 10 countries. And then there's the Regional Wetlands Working Group, which I'm coordinating, which have 3 members from each country, from the Ramsar, from CBD, and from the Ministry of Water. And of course, all this, then we use this to involve our stakeholders so that we move collectively into conserving our peatlands, wetlands, and the Nile River. Thank you.
I just want you to stick around there for a minute. You can use the speaker over there. Thank you so much, Leonard, for that. I mean, it's really exciting. So 20 years on since the formation of NBI, congratulations. Intergovernmental processes, really exciting. And I just want to prompt you with a question very quickly. So you say that sometimes when something is happening in another country, particularly for transboundary wetland systems, peatland systems, is there a conversation that's happening beyond the boundaries of NBI, for instance, within the East Africa community, for example? Do you move this to that level of jurisdiction?
Yes, because, for instance, I will use the East African community, which you have mentioned. East Africa community deals with Lake Victoria and the 5 counties of the East Africa, 6, I think, if you add Sudan. And the White Nile springs from this region. So there is need for us to work together. And even if you look at those transboundary wetlands I've mentioned, most of them are coming from the lake region where we have most of the peatlands and the wetlands. And therefore, we have to work together. So there is a memorandum of understanding between Nile Basin and the Lake Victoria Basin Commission so that we jointly develop our work program, we jointly work together. And if you look at, for instance, the Mara River, the MOU which has been signed between Tanzania and Tanzania and Kenya for the Mara River, which is also part of the Nile, NBI and Lake Victoria Basin Commission, plus the countries are working together to ensure that the memorandum of understanding and the joint programs are delivered. So there is a working together between Nile Basin and all those other blocks which forms the Nile Basin, be it Lake Victoria and others. Yeah.
So much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I would just like to invite Samer to now kind of do a little bit of a deep dive, to give us a little bit of a case study on the multiplicity of these ecosystems, as we've already heard.
Sorry again?
I'm just saying their multiplicity, you know, the multiple benefits they provide, you know, how exciting, and so.
Yeah, I hope I will be excited enough. I think it would be a little bit of science, so if anybody is still...
Do you have a
feeling
presentation?
Huh?
Do you have a presentation?
Yes.
Okay, can you please load the presentation?
But first, maybe I ask everybody to stand up and like stretch a little bit.
Yes,
I feel
that's
like
good.
everyone is cozy and sleeping. So, yeah. He's sleeping again. So if you stretch, I will get the presentation. Next presentation, please. Yeah. Okay, have we stretched, all of us? Are we awake again? Yes. He's the one who needs to stretch. Yeah, okay.
If we can have the next presentation, please. Thank you.
Okay. So my name is Samir. I'm actually from Egypt. So I'm from the country in the Nile Basin that doesn't have peatlands, or if it has, which Alex says, it's probably very little. But yeah, so we argue about that a lot. But I work in the Greifswald Maya Center. I came into the peatlands by coincidence, and now 5 years going on with that. So it is interesting for me. I understand the feeling of people who hear about peatlands, because the first time I heard it, I had no imagination of it. I've never seen it. And then I saw it. That was my first time that I saw a peatland. It was in January in the Netherlands, and I was walking in my boots. It was -5 or something like that. And then my feet is in the water for, I think it was 8 or 9 hours, and I was just not understanding why the hell are we there. So peatland, they tend to be like these mystical, very difficult to see, very rough things. So that's what we are talking about. I will talk about the peatlands in the Nile Basin, which are luckily not cold. They are not rough for other people, but they are often like papyrus peatlands or other things that people in the Nile Basin tend to not go in there. So in the Nile Basin, when we go to the people and say, "Oh, that's a peatland, do you walk in there?" No, 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 man, we don't walk in there. There are a lot of hippos. We don't walk in there. So that's what we talk about. This project that we are working on, like to just give the background, is funded from the German government as a way for carbon compensation, because we are talking about climate change. So governments invest in other places for to like compensate for CO2 emissions and climate change and so on. And they implement the project with GIZ together with the MBI, and then they asked us to consult them on the Nile Basin peatland to provide them a map and to provide them with a sort of an idea of how much carbon is there. To give another, I would like to start first that in the Nile Basin, often what we see is this map here. You see Africa, and then for each country you see the emission, the total emission of the country. But then you see in the color the percentage of how much emissions are coming from the drained peatlands for each country. So this is, for some countries, it's quite high. Like you see in the middle of the map, where in the middle of the area of the red, you have Rwanda, Burundi, and Uganda. And the emissions from the peatland tend to be more than 50% of the total emission from cement and fossil fuel. So these are really large emissions from such small areas. And so when the Nile Basin, they wanted to know the project, they wanted to know how much is those peatlands have carbon in there, and how much can they avoid from that. And this is the study setting. I will not get into that because I will take you step by step. So the first step was that we wanted to do some mapping that Alex has talked about, and then we wanted to do field trip to confirm this mapping, and some things are collated data from literature. So that was the first step. From the desk, we see ideas, and then we go to the field and we confirm that. So this data collation got us to an estimation of the areas of the peatlands in the Nile Basin. And you see like this big green thing is the Sud in South Sudan, which is a very large, possibly one of the largest peatland areas in Africa. And it is difficult to say if that's true or not, because South Sudan, as we know, there is a lot of conflict and it's difficult to access to see. But you see also other countries that have considerable amount of peatlands. Like for instance, the red one is Uganda, because it's one country where the whole country is part of the Nile Basin, so it has a large area of peatlands. But for instance, Congo here in the Nile Basin are very small, but Congo in reality has the biggest peatland in Africa. So here we are talking only about the Nile Basin, and then as I go, I will talk only about the upstream countries, so Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi, and Uganda. So you see, this is our map of the peatlands in the Nile Basin countries in the upstream part to keep it easy. And you see all the data that we have either from literature or the data that we collected from the field itself. And in a lot of areas, you see that a lot of peatlands are actually across the border. So you have on the left side, next to box number 5, you have peatlands that are going across all the border between Tanzania and Rwanda, and below it, all the peatlands that are going between Burundi and Rwanda. And they are basically, the peatland is the border between the countries. Together, those 6 countries have about like 40% of the peatlands in the Nile Basin, more or less. So to get an idea of the emissions, we wanted to know how many of those are actually drained peatlands. Those are the peatlands where the water level goes down, the water doesn't stay at the surface anymore, and that makes the CO2 escape into the atmosphere. So that's another map that you have from the satellite images. You got all ideas of which areas are drained and which areas are not, and then you see in the colors, like the purple color are the areas where you have heavy drainage, so the water level drops like 1 meter below the surface or more, and in other areas it's a little bit smaller, so maybe not so below, or the aerial extent and so on. And from these areas, like for instance, this is one of the pictures that's on the area that I told you on the border between Rwanda and Burundi. And in the middle, you see like a small river meandering in there, and that river is the border between Rwanda and Burundi. On one side, one country is extracting the peat for energy, and on the other side, the other country is doing agriculture on rice. So both drain the peatland, but one drains it more than the other. So that's another problem that needs to be dealt with in terms of restoration. Also, if you want to talk about restoring landscapes in Africa, you have to think about the role of the Nile Basin when they have to deal with such things and how to bring countries together. So this is one example of draining a peatland. So you start to get to the point that the peat looks that black. You have to lower the water level like 3 meters below, and then you start to extract all the peat. And on the other side, they lower it only like 1 meter, and then they have like a little bit width, and then they can grow rice on that. And this is a closer picture of rice production, also from Rwanda. And then you see like this canal in the middle where they have drained the peatland, and then the water level. You have to imagine the peatland is always, the water is almost always at the surface. When you walk in there, you will always get wet. But when I walk in here, I don't get wet at all. Another example is I'm standing in the water there, and that's a ditch built in Uganda. And that's one of the examples where they build the road, so they have to drain, to put all the water level down, and then they build the road across, and they put such a ditch to get the water out of the peatland. all these things lead to CO2 emissions, and all these things lead to all kind of ecosystem services lost. Um, so the other ditch that I fell in was 2 meters deep. So I'm almost 195. I fell in completely in the water. Here it's only like 50 centimeters deep. You have to imagine that the water level was almost as high as I was. Like the surface and the side is dry now, is higher than that. So that's a lot of water to go down. So that brings us to if we have an area of peatlands, we have the carbon in there, and then you have an area of drained peatland. That means that the carbon is going out of it, and then we make some sort of scenarios, and then we use all kind of data from the IPCC, and then we get an idea of the emission. And that looks something like this. So on the left side, for you, you have the carbon stock, and that's like how much carbon is in the peatland. So if a peatland is like 10 meters, then it has like 10 units of carbon, and then if it's drained, then it starts to emit CO2. So on the red line, you see that the areas of the peatlands the areas of peatland that are drained are increasing over time because of the acceleration in the land use, and that leads to more emissions. And in the emissions, which is on the right side, you see that it's like going from 0 to 678. And that is basically how much would be avoided to be emitted if you would keep those peatlands wet. So in 35 years, the peatlands in the Nile Basin would emit that amount of carbon, of CO2. And this is megaton of CO2, so then you have to multiply by 1 million, one with 6 zeros next to it. And this is like the peatlands in the Nile Basin are only 0.01% of the total Nile Basin area, and they are responsible for so much emission from the countries in the Nile Basin, which means if they have to report to the UNFCCC or anything, then the emissions are mainly, it's about restoring the peatlands would actually save them 50% of their emissions. That's the concept here. The problem is peatlands are overlooked, like in the Nile Basin or so. On many countries, we go to wetland officers who don't even know what a peatland is. And that is just because it's not something that people use. It's just like in Europe, they had to use the peatland because they had to make fuel out of it. They had electricity. But in Africa, it's just overlooked as wasteland. And that's one of the issues that I want to talk about. So the peatlands, they exist a lot in the Nile Basin and all kinds of landscapes. Alex has shown you the picture. But they are also often looked as something that needs to be tamed. So tamed either that you need to take it out, to take all the peat out to make energy. Or you would think about, like I'm from Egypt, as I said, Egypt has all kind of ideas to take the water out of the Sud peatlands to increase the surface runoff so that the White Nile is only given 10% of the water to Egypt, but 90% is coming from the Blue Nile. So the idea is that the swamps in the Nile, they let the water evaporate, they don't let the water come to the downstream country. So you see all kind of ideas that Lake Shioga, we need to drain all the swamp to get the water out. We need to make a Junglai canal to take the water out of South Sudan, out of the Sud to go down to the downstream country. These are ideas that might be beneficial in the short term, yes, but on the long term, you lose a lot of things. And so these are always something I always feel in conflict with, because I'm from Egypt, I grew up there, that's where I know how important the Nile is, but I also know how important it is for the upstream countries and how important is it not to lose these things. So peatlands are not a beast that you need to use, you need to tame, you need to make it into your own landscape, no. And that's why, because like now the bigger picture is all about the greenhouse gas, but it's not only that, there are also other things like that you don't lose all your flood, because the peatlands, they often are like a sponge. So if you have a flood and extra water, then the peatlands suck in the water, so they don't let you all this flooding. Other thing that they keep the groundwater table high, because they block the water, so they keep it higher in the upper stream. If you drain it, then you lose all your groundwater table. There's also the biodiversity. So these are all examples of things that you could lose when you drain a peatland. There are also other ideas on how to use the peatland as a productive area, which is was invented in Greifswald Maya Center as a paludic culture, which is basically the term where you could do production on a peatland but under wet conditions. So the only condition is that you don't drain the peatland, but you can use it, and that's sustainable enough and would not lead to high emission. This is, of course, still under development, but it's something to be considered. There needs to be a lot of knowledge, awareness of what a peatland is, where are they, how do they look like, and we hope that such reports bring out some discussions like this. There needs to be capacity building, because you cannot be a wetland officer if you don't know something that is large part of wetlands around the world. They need to know that, they need to discuss about it, how to restore it, how to deal with it, how to make it beneficial for everyone. So this is a statement board from my head boss, Hans Joosten. Peatlands must be wet, they must be wet forever, they must be wet for everyone, and they must be wet for humanity. And if a peatland is not wet, it has to be rewetted now and not later. Yeah, okay, thank you.
I was actually going to ask you a question whilst you were standing there, but since you're back over to your seat, I mean, this is really interesting. I just want to pick up a little bit on the last point, the knowledge, the capacity development, the awareness, and maybe any one of you can respond, especially for you, Alex, because you've worked in this field for a very long time. The raising of awareness on peatlands, why are we talking about it 20 plus years later? What is it that we're not doing right, talking about these ecosystems? The raising of awareness around these wetland ecosystems. What are we not doing right? He's got the...
That's a very difficult question, because it's a matter of the perception of history of how wetlands came together. Wetlands in the Nile Basin are always about the river. It's about water flow in and out. So most of the things that you read about the peatland, I think Alex knows that more than I do. It's always about how much water is coming in, how much rain, and how much water out. It's always about the surface hydrology. The groundwater, the peatlands are always often overlooked. Peatlands in the Nile Basin, most of the papers until the 80s or the 90s were always considered only the high lands, above 2,000 meters and higher, because they consider these are the conditions that are similar to Europe, where you have peatlands. So before
the alpine ones.
Yeah. So there are a lot of things where people just don't consider. And for instance, papyrus is a very difficult, which is the dominant peatland type, vegetation type. It is often what we call these floating mats, and it's often that you see there is 1 meter of water or something like that below the papyrus, so you think there is no ground. While in reality, sometimes you have, like in Rwanda, there is 20 meters of peat under papyrus.
Wow, that's fascinating.
So Alex might add more.
Yeah, of course, the broader international frame, I think, need to be set to the fires in Indonesia. So I think the peatland fire, is a big thing that has raised awareness of politicians, or to look at this, what is happening there. So, and a long time it was about, it's only wildfire, but no, it's the drained peatland, and it burns so much that I think in 2015, almost the Malaysian government wanted to go into Indonesia to put the fire out. It was 1 million hectare burning for weeks, and in Sumatra, in some areas, yes, the first really large fire has been in 1997. This got then the first scientific attention, and in Sumatra there are areas where 30% of the children below 5 years have asthmatic diseases. So that's really injuring a lot of people. So the smoke is going to Singapore, to Kuala Lumpur. And I think this was one thing that really got a lot of interest and attraction. And this is also one thing I would like to highlight for Africa. So we know that here is a lot of peatlands. And of course, there's pressure to use them. But so far, you have with the inland basin areas that are not easy to drain. I think this was one thing that made them be pristine so far, but we see that it is accelerating, and that the people are going to drain them. And then you got probably similar problems. And on top of this is that biomass burning in Africa, Africa is by far the largest source of biomass burning. The people are burning like hell. Yeah. But if you then have the dry peatlands, so this is a kind of bad scenario. If you're now going to drain them and the people are spreading fire around, then you may end up in comparable trouble than Indonesia.
Thank you. In fact, I was just talking to somebody, one of the taxi drivers a few days ago coming over here, and he was talking a lot about burning, even here in Accra, like around some wetlands and stuff like that, which is quite problematic. Anyway, we're going to have some time for questions, which I think there's so many burning issues, connections to environment and health and businesses, etc. Alban, so do you have a presentation? Yeah. Okay. If our guy is still... can we wake the gentleman at the back to put the presentation on for us, please?
Very good. Very good.
He must be very tired.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, whilst it's being loaded, I just want to introduce Alban, who's coming from ICI, which is the International Climate Initiative of the German government. And he's going to talk about, really now we're going to talk about the funding mechanisms, but also from him, the priority of really working around peatland ecosystems. The gentleman can load it, please. And as you saw from the presentation from Samer, ICI has also funded one of the funding streams focusing on climate in particular, just sort of dedicated climate funding from a single donor. So over to you, Alban.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alban Kisife. I'm very happy to be here in Accra at the Global Landscapes Forum. I'm actually going to be presenting the International Climate Initiative of the Federal Ministry for the Environment in Germany, and its engagement with regards to peatlands. But then, heads up, I would like to actually thank my colleagues on the panel who have actually given us the basis of peatlands in the Nile Basin. But then I would like to add up on that to actually situate this in international context so that we actually find out how important these peatlands are actually for the global carbon budget. To start with, peatlands, for example, are estimated to cover just about 3% of the Earth's surface, but then they cover, or they are said to be home of the largest terrestrial carbon stocks. That is about, for example, twice as much carbon stored in there as in the world's forests. So actually, when you're looking at peatlands, we are looking at a chance of actually saving our climates by actually conserving these peatlands. And like I said, these are estimates. We haven't actually mapped the global scale of peatlands as they are today, because following studies in 2017 from the United Nations or United Kingdom team of researchers and also researchers from the Republic of Congo, they discovered a cuvette central, which is one of the world's largest peatlands, covering almost the size of England, with about 145,000 square kilometers. Now, this is emissions of about 30 billion tons. If you're looking at that in relation to what the United Nations emits in 15 years, that's worth the amount of carbon stored in these peatlands in the cuvette central in the Congo Basin. So actually, the Paris Agreement cannot actually be achieved, or the goal of reaching 1.5 degrees cannot be achieved without actually taking peatlands more into the focus, actually seeing how we can conserve peatlands that are still intact, but then also re-wet peatlands that have been drained or used for other purposes. So actually, I am going to be presenting the International Climate Initiative, its engagement to peatlands conservation and restoration, but then also highlighting the next coming call for proposals, which is going to be a part of the International Climate Initiatives at the end, or maybe say by the COP in Chile, that is by the end of November. There's going to be a call for proposals wherein peatlands are going to be highlighted. So that's actually the outline of what I'm going to be presenting today. So the International Climate Initiative, what is it? International Climate Initiative was created by the German government or the German Ministry for the Environment and Nature Protection in 2008 to actually accompany partner governments in implementing projects on climate mitigation, adaptation to climate change, but also on conserving biodiversity. So the International Climate Initiative funds projects along three major funding areas. Like I said, mitigation of climate, greenhouse gases, for example, projects on renewable energies on the transport sector, for example, or on sustainable housing facilities. Uh-oh. Is it back? Yeah. So the second area is on adaptation to climate change, projects on ecosystem-based adaptation, but also nature-based adaptation projects are being funded within this support area too. Then we have conserving natural carbon sinks with a focus on reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, where we have, for example, projects on REDD+, helping countries who are actually looking forward to getting resource-based payments from the United Nations framework. But then also we have projects here on natural carbon sinks, for example, with peatlands. And there we have projects which I'm going to be revisiting after here, a couple of examples of projects which are funding on natural carbon stocks, which peatlands are a part of. Then we're having projects also on conservation of biodiversity and actually aimed at achieving the goals of the Convention of Biological Diversity. So the disbursement of funds by the International Climate Initiative since 2008 to 2017 in million euros. So up till now, the International Climate Initiative has launched more than 730 climate and biodiversity projects since 2008. So the funding for projects has been increasing steadily from 2008 up to 2017. And now the drive is actually to move from the classical projects which have been funding now to more to programs where actually implementing organizations have to team up to be able to apply for a program with much more higher funding volumes compared to the projects we've been funding in the range of about 3 to 5 million euros per project. Now we are moving into programs where, for example, the WWF, the IUCN, the Food and Agriculture Organization, could, for example, could team up as a consortium to apply for a program with a funding volume between 15 to 25 million euros. So we are actually moving forward, looking forward at funding larger programs compared to the classical projects we've been funding since 2008 right up till present. So we also have the EKI project funding volume by funding area since 2008 to 2017. And here you can see actually the percentages of funding spread across the 4 major funding areas which the International Climate Initiative funds projects across. And just to give you a quick overview of how much that actually is, that's about 2.8 billion euros in funding, for example, since 2008. That's also a large amount of funding which the International Climate Initiative has been investing in partner countries in terms of funding for climate mitigation, for adaptation, but also for biodiversity conservation. So coming now to the International Climate Initiative's portfolio on peatlands, at the moment we do not have so many projects on peatlands. So we have, for example, 4 projects currently being implemented on peatlands, and 1 has been completed and 2 are still in the pipeline. But then that's approximately 20 million euros, excluding projects not yet commissioned, because these projects have not yet, cannot yet be officially communicated since they are still in the review process. But then why am I showing you these figures? I'm actually trying to make you aware of the fact that we are looking forward to extending the portfolio of peatland projects within the International Climate Initiative. I'm going to get in the next slide to more details on how, for example, the International Climate Initiative is looking forward to extending this portfolio on peatlands. So here we have about 4 projects which are currently running, and I would like to just go through this shortly. You have the mitigation adaptation through conservation and sustainable livelihoods in Indonesia's peat and mangrove ecosystems. This is a project being implemented by the Conservation International in Sumatra and in Sumatra, in Indonesia, and they're actually working together with the local populations to actually look for sustainable means of exploiting the peatlands, the peatlands in Sumatra, wherein, for example, they're introducing fish farming, paludiculture, but also wetland cultivation in terms of conservation of peatlands in the region. So we also have the strengthening of regional experiences on sustainable peatland management in Indonesia and Malaysia, which are also sharing experiences with regards to peatland management, since these are focus countries with large extents of peatland in Indonesia. Then we have, for example, the Global Peatlands Initiative, which is actually the host of this of today's session here, which has actually been funded by the ICI, but then the main implementing partner or the main implementing organization is UN Environment. The aim of this Global Peatlands Initiative is actually to bring out the status and the extent of peatlands and their value for the global carbon cycle, to make it, to bring it to the agenda of the international climate debate. They are also looking forward to creating a platform for knowledge exchange on peatland, but then also to developing a hotspots atlas where you can actually find out where in the peatlands are most degraded and their status at the moment. So we also have the last project, they're restoring peatlands in Russia for fire prevention and climate change mitigation. So we are having a lot of rewetting activities in Russia, where we're actually rewetting already degraded or drained peatlands, for example, in Russia. So these are just a few of the projects we are having. But what do you notice when you looking at these projects? We have very few projects in Africa. And that is why I'm very interested about the fact that we have here with the Nile Basin Initiative, that we could actually maybe turn out proposals for the next call for proposals going to be published by the end of November this year at the International Climate Initiative, so that we're actually harnessing all the resources we have to actually keep this valuable peatlands that we actually need for the combating the climate change. So I'm going to actually now dive into the next call for proposals, which the International Climate Initiative is anticipating to make online by the end of November. So you can always please check on our website on project funding and also on the documents available. There you're going to find information on the new call for proposals 2.0, and for the very first time, peatlands will be a special focus area within this call of proposals. So it is high time for those looking for funding for peatlands to actually use this opportunity to submit proposals to make sure that we actually, getting a whole grasp of the extent, because like I'm saying, we're having estimates. We do not actually know how peatlands are distributed nationwide on the globe. We are see, like the example we had with the Cuvette Central, we discovered that just in 2017 that we have an area almost the size of England with peatlands and covering so much carbon stocks compared to about 15 years of emissions of the United States. So we are not so sure if you have actually gotten a grasp of all peatlands as they are on the globe. So it is an opportunity for every implementing organization to actually look up for this call for proposals come end of November. So thank you very much for giving me some of your time. I'm very happy that I was able to bring to you closer the International Climate Initiative, but also its engagement in regards to peatlands protections.
Thank you so very much, Alban. I think it's really, really exciting, please, because we just have about 15 minutes, or actually under 15 minutes, to just have a conversation, get some questions from the floor. I think it's really fantastic that you made a presentation on this, and in fact, ICI was one of the funding organizations that funded one of the most exciting initiatives on mountains that I coordinated a few years ago. And a number of these landscapes actually had alpine peat systems, which is quite interesting and very interesting how communities were very much involved in that. So I want to open for the floor to ask questions, clarify. Please introduce yourself. We'll start with Tandy over there. I'll take about 3 questions, and then we can take it up from there.
Thank you very much, Musonda, and your excellent panelists. It's been very enlightening to listen to all of you. A lot of learning for me, and I think at some point I almost got scared listening to Samer, because I think while there is all these great initiatives like the Nile Basin Initiative, there's of course the Niger Delta Initiative, I'm a bit confused in how you reconcile the tension between exploiting, if I may use that word, exploiting the peatlands sustainably for things like agriculture and other development initiatives like infrastructure, and the governance in the regions where around transboundary issues, where one country is using it for one purpose, the other is trying to maybe preserve it. The reconciliation of these issues for me sounded quite scary, actually, when I listened to Samer. Informative as it was, it sounds like you're chasing the wind. One's trying to manage this from one perspective, and another country is on a totally different trajectory. So your knowledge and guidance on how you're dealing with this very complex thing,
Okay.
which we need to survive, obviously.
Great. We'll take 2 more questions. Okay, if you can introduce yourself, please.
Well, can you hear me? All right. My name is Mohammed Falaki. I'm from Nigeria. And I think my question needs some feedback as I'm asking. And this more directly goes to Alex. In your presentation, you're still trying to identify peatlands, especially in the western part of Africa, where you have data but not yet mapped. So am I correct if I say validation is a challenge? Am I right? Yeah. Validation is a challenge in terms of identifying peatlands and their nature in that part of Africa. Am I right?
Of course it is a challenge, yes.
It's a challenge. All right. And time and time again, you put in a lot of resources, like Iki coming in to fund projects, to try to fund projects around peatlands and what have you. And I don't know, it's just an idea that I've been having for quite some time. You need to involve the public as much as possible. Volunteer information is valuable. And the example I'm going to give is the OpenStreetMap, where is volunteer geographic information, where people come on a platform to give, because they are there, they help in mapping particular areas, but OpenStreetMap is customized for streets. But in terms of peatlands that are in an environment, a system can actually be developed in the sense that institutions that actually work are in such locations, it can be agriculture, it can be mining, a lot of such things, all right? This information will be valuable in the sense that you have institutions that have the interest of getting that particular information that you require to come in and volunteer in helping you map these things. It's far-fetched, maybe it's too technical to understand, but the whole idea is you identify institutions that work around these areas, okay, that will volunteer to actually help you map out. And the system will have a template in which it validates and has this quality control at the end of the day. And this validation will come embedding ecosystem services framework in it, in trying to understand to better understand how the environment works. Instead, I'm sure Iki coming in to fund projects around peatlands, it's one way, but I think globally, when you have a system, just like the OpenStreetMap, but customized for the environment, where you identify, it can be a public thing, because it's not everyone that utilizes these peatlands or being able to actually volunteer to give you this information. But if you identify institutions that work around there, I'm sure they'll be ready to use their resources to help you map these places, because they also need such data for different uses.
Right.
Yeah.
Just hold the thought, Alex. Is there any burning question? We get one more because we've only got like 5 minutes before we close. Please, if you can introduce yourself.
My name is Mariam, and I'm from Ghana. I'm a Ghanaian. I would like to know, would you see all swampy areas and waterlogged areas are peatlands? Because this is new to me. And in my area where I live, it's swampy. And we have some Chinese who have been filling the place and building on it. So what is the effects of that if swampy areas are peatlands? Then?
Okay.
Thank you.
So we have 3 questions about the conflict, this, challenges and complexities of supposedly, competing elements. And then, of course, how do we, get almost using all the different sectors to kind of contribute to this data gaps. And then this construction element, I think you did show the picture from Rwanda, and also about how the Rwandese government stopped the whole construction site in Kigali, in the capital, under the ruling of a presidency because of exactly that. So if you can begin to respond, react.
Maybe coming to you. So we are sure, so in the west, the border to Ivory Coast, we have this vast wetland complex, the Amanzuri wetland, and this is partly, I think, mainly peat swamp forest. So this is known, this has been mapped, you can find publication about. And then if you go further a bit to Ivory Coast, it is very likely, and I have some former colonial map that actually show larger areas also being peat swamp forest. So then actually we will be, my colleague Sama and me, we will take some 4 days after this event here to going to the Volta region. And we have a small coring device with us, so we have seen from satellite image what looks promising, and where we have the information that it's swampy. And we will go there, looking for what we have there. I think there's a fair chance that at least several of these areas of the lagoons, surrounding lagoons, Kita Lagoon, could have also peatlands. And if you construct something of that, if it is only a small peatland and you construct a lot of things, large area, yeah, then it's gone. It's just covered by beton, by your house. But for example, in Malaysia, as we have been there in 2017, they told us there was this peat swamp burning also, then they cleared everything, and then they built new houses for people, and they give them only 2 years insurance. Wow. They have been known why. So if you have a large peatland area and just drain it a bit and then you put a house on this will not last long. The peat will sink into the ground and then it get cracks in the wall. So that's what I think. This is a kind of crime, let's say, to the people that buy actually the house that will not last long time.
Do you want to react to his question since you have the mic? If you can respond, his contribution.
Yeah, I would be really very happy to go in deeper cooperation with national agencies about these. I would like to contribute, yes, but also to give them our feedback and knowledge. So it would not be one-way street, so that we together employ some, together build up a peatland organic soil scheme for the national scale, it is sometimes not really easy to get in touch to the agencies. And also the next thing is, especially I'd say in the southern countries, that there is not the knowledge available that we are looking for. So as long they have not used, it's just wasteland, and they have not considered. And then if they have mapped this and if they have trained this, then sometimes also not easy to get into the archives. So it's would need kind of special agreement probably, because also from a kind of colonial past background, if we coming there and asking for data for them. I would like to cooperate much more on this level also, and if we get requests for our data, we usually give it out freely. So also the Ugandan forest officers got them for just because you need it, because you need to know, and we have it. So
Great. Okay, Leonard, do you want to react to Tandy and Samir perhaps?
Yes, thank you for the question. There are no easy answers to such questions, because these countries have their own interest. Some countries are more keen on food security, so they are reclaiming these wetlands for agriculture. Other countries are keen on energy security, so they are reclaiming these peatlands or wetlands for energy. So there is no easy answer for that. But within NBI, what we do is to cultivate and nurture collaboration to ensure that these countries are talking. They are developing common principles and which then they agree on and they can then collaborate on. And from my presentation, I gave 2 examples. One of which is that through NBI, there are some countries which have not been collaborating or even talking for joint natural resource management or peatlands management. But now through what we are doing of transboundary wetlands plans, which also have peatlands in it, now these countries are developing this transboundary. We are facilitating, but they are developing these transboundary management plans, and then they will jointly implement. So we see this in between Kenya and Uganda. We see this between Tanzania and Uganda. We see this between DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Uganda when you talk of Semiliki. So through these transboundary management plans, whereby they generate information, they prioritize actions, and then they mobilize resources through our support for the investments on those bankable projects. We see these countries now coming together with common principles to manage some of these wetlands. It's happening in some parts, but some parts there are still challenges. Also, if you see the Mara River, which is between Tanzania and Kenya, there is a memorandum of understanding between the 2 countries. Now we have moved to the level where we are developing a common water allocation plan. We are doing, we have done assessment on environmental flow so that we can allow water to go to the wetlands, to go to the peatlands. So we see those as cases of success. And we hope that then, if this management planning or water allocation planning joint in Mara and in these transboundary areas, if this works and are successful, then we can replicate all this within the basin. Right. So this is what we are doing to bring these countries together so that they can conserve some of these key peatlands and wetlands. Thank you.
Great. We're standing in between our tea and our break before we go back into plenary, but any thoughts? Samir, did you have any reaction to the question? Oh, it's too common. Okay.
Maybe if you can attempt an answer to her question regarding the wetlands in Ghana, if they are peatlands. Definitely, you can't tell if wetlands are peatlands, but then it is clear that peatlands, all peatlands are wetlands. We would need actually to do some research, take some, say some specimens from there to be able to actually check if the wetlands in Ghana actually are peatlands. So the rule of thumb is all peatlands are wetlands, but then not all wetlands are peatlands. So definitely you would need to do some research to be able to find out if that was is in Ghana, is also a peatland or not. So these are, that's what I can actually contribute to this. I think the colleagues from Grassfight Maya Institute are better placed to give you a more determined answer to that.
And, okay.
Okay, so I just want to say that I'm sorry if I scared you, but the problem is we are talking about peatlands. Global-wise, they emit 5% of the total emissions on the global level. So they are a huge source of CO2 emissions. And that's why if we want to go to zero emission 2050, then peatlands to wet now is already urgent enough. And then when you see that on the other side, people are starting to do the opposite of that, and it will take you a lot of years to restore these things. And then the problem is more complex when you're talking about transboundary, because then who is going to do it? Because if one country decides to restore, but the other one says no, then none of them will be able to restore anything. So these questions are really necessary, and such initiatives of the Nile Basin is very important. And yeah, it is scary, of course. That's all.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I just want to add that this year in March, we had the UN Environment Assembly in Nairobi, which brought together governments from all over the world and all the Nile Basin countries where these peatlands exist. So there was a resolution that was actually passed where they made a commitment to conserving and managing these peatlands sustainably. So at the intergovernmental level, there's a dedication, and there's obviously a commitment on that front. And tomorrow I'm going to speak a little bit in the plenary about the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. I would have spoken about it here, but in the interest of time, I'm going to speak about it actually there, because I think this decade is really an opportunity for people to think about that exactly. But I think what I want to challenge you as well in the audience is, how do we have information at the community level for people to understand that their actions are not just have implications at the local level? If this emission, these gases don't choose which border they're crossing and going where. We listen to the issue, what happened in Indonesia, the gases going across into Singapore, children being asthmatic and people getting sick. There are implications for our actions, and I think we need to advocate for this and find ways in which we communicate this seemingly complex information, but it isn't. But I also want to say, within the Nile Basin, one thing that we didn't have a moment to discuss in the interest of time is that the role of women and young people in these wetland systems, they use them all the time. And perhaps even as an entry into the youth and women who are using the wetlands on an everyday basis, and sometimes they may not be aware of what their actions or their over-obstruction or extraction may be, I think is a critical element as well. I just want us to give them a round of applause for the great conversation, and a round of applause for you for coming to a session. Thank you. And thank you very much to the technical person who's over there. Thank you. So enjoy your tea, and we're restarting, I think, in the main hall at 16:45.